May 8, 1945, Nazi Germany surrenders unconditionally, and across Europe, hundreds of thousands of men wearing black uniforms with silver skull insignia suddenly find themselves among the most wanted individuals on Earth. The SS, Hitler's elite paramilitary organization, had been responsible for implementing the regime's most horrific policies, from operating concentration camps to carrying out mass executions across occupied territories. But as the dust settled on the war's end, these men didn't simply vanish into history. Some faced justice at Nuremberg and other tribunals. Others disappeared into carefully planned escape networks that would spirit them away to distant continents. Many more melted back into civilian life, assuming new identities and careers as if their previous roles had never existed. What you're about to discover is a story that spans decades and continents. From war crimes trials in occupied Germany to cattle ranches in Argentina. From quiet suburban neighborhoods in America to monastery hideouts in Austria. It's the story of how some of history's most notorious criminals evaded justice, how others were quietly rehabilitated into positions of power, and how the pursuit of these men became one of the longest-running manhunts in human history. The truth about what really happened to the SS after the war is far more complex, controversial, and disturbing than most people realize. The scale of the challenge facing Allied authorities in 1945 was staggering beyond comprehension. The SS had grown from Hitler's personal bodyguard of 280 men in 1929 to a massive organization of over 800,000 personnel by the war's end. This wasn't just a military unit, it was a state within a state, controlling everything from intelligence operations to industrial enterprises, from racial policies to territorial administration. Within this vast organization were men whose names would become synonymous with the Holocaust's worst atrocities. Adolf Eichmann had coordinated the deportation of millions to death camps. Josef Mengele had conducted horrific medical experiments on prisoners at Auschwitz. Klaus Barbie had tortured resistance fighters in Lyon. Alois Brunner had organized deportations across multiple countries. These weren't just soldiers following orders. They were the architects and implementers of systematic genocide. But the SS also included hundreds of thousands of others: camp guards, administrators, drivers, clerks, and support personnel. Some had joined for ideological reasons, others for career advancement, and many because it provided exemption from frontline military service. The question of individual culpability would prove to be one of the most complex legal and moral challenges of the post-war era. The organization's structure had been deliberately compartmentalized to diffuse responsibility and maintain security. The SS Totenkopfverbände operated the concentration camps, the Einsatzgruppen carried out mass killings in Eastern Europe, the Waffen-SS fought as elite military units, and the SS Rasse- und Siedlungshauptamt implemented racial policies. Many members could claim they knew nothing about activities outside their specific sphere of responsibility. As Germany collapsed in the spring of 1945, SS units began destroying documentation on a massive scale. Personnel files, operational records, and evidence of war crimes were systematically burned or buried. Some officers had spent months preparing false identities and escape routes, while others had hidden assets in neutral countries. The most sophisticated had created entire networks of sympathizers and safe houses that would facilitate their disappearance. The geographical spread of SS activities across Nazi-occupied Europe meant that potential war criminals were scattered across a continent. Some were captured immediately as Allied forces overran SS installations, but thousands had already begun melting away into the chaos of Germany's collapse. Others had been transferred to different units or locations as the military situation deteriorated, making their identification even more difficult. Intelligence estimates suggested that tens of thousands of SS personnel had successfully evaded immediate capture. Many had discarded their uniforms and documentation, assuming civilian identities as refugees or displaced persons. Others had hidden in forests, mountains, or rural areas where they could avoid Allied patrols. Some had even infiltrated prisoner of war camps, posing as regular Wehrmacht soldiers to avoid the special scrutiny reserved for SS members. The task of identifying, locating, and prosecuting these individuals would require unprecedented international cooperation and resources. But as the initial euphoria of victory gave way to the practical challenges of occupation and reconstruction, the political will for such an extensive undertaking would prove to be fragile and inconsistent. The Cold War's emerging tensions would further complicate matters as former enemies became potential allies in the struggle against communism. Some SS officers possessed intelligence or technical knowledge that Western powers found valuable, creating moral compromises that would haunt the pursuit of justice for decades to come. What happened next would determine whether the post-war world would successfully hold accountable those responsible for unprecedented crimes against humanity, or whether the chaos and complexity of Europe's reconstruction would allow many to escape the consequences of their actions entirely. As Allied forces closed in on the crumbling Reich, a sophisticated network of escape routes began operating across Europe. Routes that would become known as ratlines. These weren't hastily improvised escape attempts, but carefully planned operations that had been prepared months or even years in advance by individuals who understood that Germany's defeat was inevitable. The most famous of these networks was organized around key figures in the Catholic Church, particularly in Rome. Bishop Alois Hudal, the Austrian rector of the German seminary in Rome, became a central figure in facilitating the escape of war criminals. Hudal believed that anti-communist sentiment justified helping former Nazis escape to South America, where they could contribute to the fight against Soviet influence. His position gave him access to Vatican documentation that could provide false identities for fleeing SS officers. The mechanics of these escape routes were remarkably sophisticated. A fleeing SS officer might begin his journey by obtaining false documentation from sympathetic officials in Austria or Italy. He would then be passed along a chain of safe houses, monasteries, and private homes, each link in the chain knowing only the next destination. The final stage typically involves securing passage on ships departing from Italian ports, particularly Genoa, bound for Argentina, Chile, or other South American countries that were willing to accept European refugees with minimal questions. Argentina under Juan Perón proved to be the most welcoming destination for fleeing Nazis. Perón's government actively recruited European immigrants, and immigration officials were instructed to be lenient about documentation irregularities. Some estimates suggest that as many as 5,000 Nazi war criminals found refuge in Argentina alone, though the exact numbers remain disputed due to the secretive nature of their arrival and the destruction of relevant records. The International Committee of the Red Cross unwittingly facilitated many of these escapes by issuing travel documents to people claiming to be stateless refugees. The organization's humanitarian mission made them reluctant to investigate the backgrounds of applicants too closely, and their documents were widely accepted by immigration authorities. Many SS officers obtained Red Cross papers using false identities, sometimes claiming to be ethnic Germans expelled from Eastern Europe. American and British intelligence services were aware of these escape networks, but chose not to interfere in many cases. Some fleeing Nazis possessed valuable intelligence about Soviet operations or advanced weapons technology that Western governments wanted to exploit. The calculus of the emerging Cold War made former enemies into potential assets, even when their wartime crimes were well documented. The most notorious example of this calculated ambivalence was the case of Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon. Despite being wanted for war crimes by French authorities, Barbie was recruited by American intelligence services and given protection in exchange for his knowledge of communist networks in France. When his usefulness ended, the Americans facilitated his escape to Bolivia, rather than turning him over to French justice. Some escape networks operated with stunning audacity. Adolf Eichmann, one of the primary architects of the Holocaust, lived openly in Argentina under the name Ricardo Clement for over a decade. He worked various jobs, brought his family to join him, and even gave interviews to sympathetic journalists. His confidence in his safety was so complete that he made little effort to disguise his identity beyond changing his name. Dr. Joseph Mengelé's escape was even more brazen. The doctor who had conducted horrific medical experiments at Auschwitz was helped by a network that included his wealthy industrialist family. After hiding in Germany and Austria for several years, Mengele traveled to South America with false papers and lived comfortably on funds provided by his family's business empire. He moved between Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil, always staying one step ahead of pursuit. The Vatican's role in these escapes remained controversial for decades. While some clergy genuinely believed they were helping refugees escape communist persecution, others were motivated by anti-Semitic sentiment or sympathy for fascist ideology. The Vatican's archives relating to this period remained sealed for decades, fueling speculation about the extent of official church involvement in war criminal escapes. Money played a crucial role in facilitating these escapes. Many SS officers had accumulated significant wealth through theft, corruption, or legitimate business activities during the war. Gold, jewelry, and artwork looted from victims were converted into funds that could finance false documents, transportation, and new lives in distant countries. Swiss banks proved particularly accommodating to customers who preferred not to discuss the origins of their deposits. But not all escape attempts were successful, and the networks that facilitated them would eventually become targets of investigation themselves. As evidence of these operations accumulated, international pressure mounted to close the ratlines and pursue those who had operated them. The hunt for escaped war criminals would evolve into a decades-long effort that would test the limits of international law and cooperation. The International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg represented humanity's first attempt to hold an entire organization criminally responsible for war crimes and crimes against humanity. When the SS was declared a criminal organization on October 1st, 1946, it meant that membership alone could be grounds for prosecution, a legal precedent that would have far-reaching implications for the thousands of SS men scattered across post-war Europe. Yet the reality of implementing this sweeping judgment proved far more complex than the legal theory suggested. The tribunal had been designed to prosecute major war criminals, the political and military leaders who bore primary responsibility for Nazi crimes. The practical challenge of dealing with hundreds of thousands of lower-ranking SS personnel fell to subsequent proceedings that would prove far less comprehensive and effective. The 12 follow-up Nuremberg trials between 1946 and 1949 targeted specific SS units and functions. The Einsatzgruppen trial prosecuted 24 members of the mobile killing units that had murdered over 1 million people in Eastern Europe. The concentration camp trials addressed the systematic murder and brutalization that had occurred in Nazi camps. The Race and Settlement Main Office trial examined the SS's role in ethnic cleansing and forced population transfers. These proceedings established important legal precedents about individual responsibility and the inadmissibility of superior orders as a defense. SS officers could no longer claim they were merely following commands. The tribunals ruled that individuals had a moral and legal duty to refuse participation in manifestly illegal acts. This principle would influence international humanitarian law for decades to come. However, the practical reach of these trials was severely limited. Of the estimated 800,000 SS members, only a few hundred faced prosecution at Nuremberg. The majority who were captured found themselves in Allied detention camps where their fates were determined by far less rigorous procedures. Many were released after superficial denazification proceedings that focused more on political rehabilitation than criminal justice. The political context surrounding these trials complicated their effectiveness. As tensions with the Soviet Union escalated, Western authorities became increasingly interested in German cooperation against the communist threat. Former SS officers with intelligence value or technical expertise found themselves transformed from war criminals into valuable assets in the emerging Cold War struggle. The case of Wernher von Braun exemplifies this moral compromise. The rocket scientist had used slave labor from concentration camps to build V2 weapons that terrorized London, and his work had been intimately connected with SS operations. Yet American authorities prioritized his knowledge of rocket technology over accountability for his wartime actions. Von Braun became a hero of the American space program, while the victims of his forced labor programs remained forgotten. Operation Paperclip, the American program to recruit German scientists and technicians, provided legal immunity to hundreds of individuals with SS connections. The justification was strategic necessity in the face of Soviet competition, but the moral cost was the abandonment of justice for documented war criminals. Many of these men went on to distinguished careers in American aerospace and weapons programs. The British and French pursued similar policies with German personnel who possessed valuable knowledge or intelligence. Former SS officers who could provide information about Soviet operations or who possessed technical expertise in weapons development found themselves welcomed rather than prosecuted. The practical demands of occupation and reconstruction took precedence over the moral imperatives established at Nuremberg. Administrative challenges also limited the effectiveness of prosecution efforts. The destruction of SS records made it difficult to establish individual roles and responsibilities. Many suspects had assumed false identities or had their true names confused with similar individuals. The sheer volume of cases overwhelmed the limited legal resources available to Allied authorities. Language barriers and cultural differences complicated the investigation process. Allied interrogators often lacked the linguistic skills and cultural knowledge necessary to effectively question German suspects. Important nuances about organizational structure, command relationships, and individual responsibilities were frequently lost in translation or misunderstood due to unfamiliarity with Nazi bureaucracy. The geographic dispersion of potential defendants created additional obstacles. Former SS men were scattered across multiple occupation zones, controlled by different Allied powers, with varying legal systems and priorities. Coordination between these different authorities was often poor, allowing suspects to exploit jurisdictional gaps and inconsistencies. Public opinion in occupied Germany was often unsympathetic to prosecution efforts. Many Germans viewed the trials as victor's justice imposed by foreign powers, rather than legitimate legal proceedings. This attitude made it difficult to obtain cooperation from witnesses and created a social environment where former SS men could find sympathy and support. As the immediate post-war period gave way to the realities of Cold War competition, the window for comprehensive prosecution began to close. The establishment of the Federal Republic of Germany in 1949 marked the beginning of a new phase in which the pursuit of former SS men would depend increasingly on German authorities who had their own political priorities and constraints. The legacy of Nuremberg's selective justice would haunt efforts to achieve accountability for decades to come. While the trials established crucial legal principles and documented Nazi crimes for history, their limited scope allowed the majority of SS perpetrators to escape serious consequences for their actions. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the post-war SS story was how many former members successfully reinvented themselves and achieved positions of prominence in legitimate society. The chaos of post-war reconstruction provided cover for individuals seeking to escape their past, while the practical demands of rebuilding German institutions created opportunities for those with administrative and technical skills. The denazification process, designed to remove Nazi influence from German society, proved largely ineffective in practice. The sheer scale of the task overwhelmed Allied resources, and the emergence of Cold War tensions shifted priorities from purging former Nazis to recruiting German allies against the Soviet Union. By 1948, most denazification procedures had been turned over to German authorities, who had little incentive for rigorous enforcement. Many former SS officers exploited the bureaucratic confusion to obtain new identity documents and employment. The destruction of records made background verification difficult, and the desperate need for educated personnel in rebuilding Germany created a willingness to overlook questionable pasts. Professional qualifications often mattered more than political history in a country struggling to restore basic services and economic functionality. The case of Hans Globke illustrates how completely some former Nazi officials were rehabilitated. Globke had been a co-author of the Nuremberg race laws that stripped Jews of citizenship and legal protection. Despite this documented involvement in the legal architecture of persecution, Globke became chief of staff to West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer and one of the most powerful men in the new Federal Republic. His expertise in constitutional law and administrative procedures made him valuable enough that his Nazi past was simply ignored. Similar patterns emerged throughout West German society. Former SS officers found positions in police forces, government agencies, educational institutions, and private businesses. Some became judges, teachers, civil servants, and business executives. Their previous experience in organizational management and administration, gained through SS service, often made them attractive candidates for positions requiring leadership and bureaucratic skills. The pharmaceutical industry proved particularly welcoming to former SS personnel. Companies like Bayer had used slave labor during the war and had conducted experiments on concentration camp prisoners, creating a culture that was comfortable with employing former SS men. Some of these individuals went on to develop important medications and medical treatments, their scientific contributions overshadowing their wartime crimes. Academic institutions also provided sanctuary for former SS members. Universities needed professors and researchers, and many former SS officers possessed advanced degrees and technical expertise. Some became respected scholars whose wartime activities remained hidden for decades. The case of Hans Schwerde, who taught German literature for decades under a false identity while concealing his past as SS officer Hans Schneider, demonstrated how completely such reinventions could succeed. The business world offered perhaps the greatest opportunities for former SS men to rebuild their lives. Many had developed valuable connections and skills during their SS service that translated well to civilian enterprise. Some founded successful companies, others joined existing firms, and many became prosperous members of Germany's economic miracle. Their ability to organize, manage resources, and navigate bureaucracy, skills honed during wartime, served them well in the competitive post-war marketplace. International corporations also proved willing to employ former SS personnel when their skills were valuable. American companies doing business in Germany often hired former SS officers as consultants or employees, valuing their knowledge of German markets and business practices over concerns about their past. The compartmentalization of wartime service made it easy to rationalize that an individual's technical abilities were separate from their political history. The medical profession saw numerous former SS doctors successfully re-establish their careers. Many who had participated in euthanasia programs or concentration camp experiments became respected physicians in civilian practice. Their medical training remained valuable regardless of how they had used it during the war, and the shortage of doctors in post-war Germany created strong incentives to overlook their past activities. Intelligence services on both sides of the Cold War actively recruited former SS officers for their expertise in Soviet affairs, Eastern European languages, and clandestine operations. The Gehlen organization, which became the foundation of West German intelligence, employed hundreds of former SS and Gestapo personnel. Similar recruitment occurred in other NATO countries, where former SS officers were valued for their anti-communist credentials and operational experience. The success of these reinventions was facilitated by social amnesia about the war years. Many Germans preferred not to examine too closely the backgrounds of those around them, recognizing that such scrutiny might reveal uncomfortable truths about their own wartime activities. A tacit social compact emerged in which the past was left unexamined in exchange for stability and economic progress. Legal protections also aided in these reinventions. Statute of limitations laws prevented prosecution for many wartime crimes after certain time periods had elapsed. Professional licensing boards rarely investigated the wartime activities of applicants, and employment discrimination based on political past was often prohibited by law. These protections, designed to promote reconciliation and prevent vindictive persecution, had the unintended effect of facilitating the rehabilitation of war criminals. The psychological adaptation required for these reinventions was remarkable. Former SS officers had to compartmentalize their wartime experiences, often developing elaborate personal narratives that minimized their responsibility or reframed their activities as patriotic service. Many became model citizens, community leaders, and family men whose public personas bore no resemblance to their wartime roles. Yet the success of these reinventions came at a profound moral cost. Victims of SS crimes were forced to live in societies where their tormentors might be their neighbors, employers, or government officials. The failure to achieve comprehensive accountability sent a message that such crimes could be committed with relative impunity, undermining faith in justice and the rule of law. As widespread SS escapes became apparent, a dedicated group emerged who would spend decades pursuing those who had evaded justice. These Nazi hunters operated with limited resources and enormous obstacles, but their persistence would lead to some of the most dramatic captures in legal history. Simon Wiesenthal became the most famous pursuer, but his work represented just one part of a broader network of investigators and activists. Wiesenthal had survived multiple concentration camps and devoted his post-war life to documenting Nazi crimes. His documentation center in Vienna became a repository for evidence and coordinating point for international efforts, eventually amassing files on over 90,000 suspected war criminals. Wiesenthal's methods were meticulous and sometimes dangerous. He cultivated networks of informants across Europe and South America, often infiltrating former Nazi communities to gather intelligence. His investigators posed as journalists, businessmen, and even fellow Germans seeking to reconnect with old comrades. The work required patience, cunning, and considerable personal risk, as many targets were protected by sympathetic governments and dangerous networks. The capture of Adolf Eichmann in 1960 demonstrated both possibilities and limitations of pursuing escaped Nazis. Israeli Mossad agents spent months conducting surveillance in Argentina, confirming that the man living as Ricardo Clement was indeed the architect of the Holocaust's logistics. The kidnapping operation required precise timing and coordination, with agents following Eichmann's routine for weeks before striking. His trial established crucial legal precedents about universal jurisdiction for crimes against humanity. The pursuit of Dr. Joseph Mengele illustrated the frustrations characterizing most Nazi hunting efforts. Despite extensive international investigations and a reward of over $3 million for his capture, Mengele successfully evaded justice for over 3 decades. He moved between Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil, protected by wealthy German expatriate families and local authorities who either sympathized with his cause or were bought off with Nazi gold. When investigators finally located his burial site in Brazil in 1985, Mengele had been dead for 6 years, having lived comfortably in exile under multiple false identities. Beate and Serge Klarsfeld emerged as another formidable hunting team, combining legal expertise with dramatic public confrontations. Beate famously slapped German Chancellor Kurt Kiesinger in public in 1968, denouncing his Nazi past. Their investigations led to Klaus Barbie's prosecution, but first they had to overcome complex political obstacles. American intelligence had protected Barbie for years, facilitating his escape to Bolivia in exchange for his services against communist movements in South America. The Klarsfelds developed innovative techniques for exposing war criminals, including publishing detailed dossiers with photographs and current addresses of suspects. They organized publicity campaigns, staged protests, and used media attention to pressure governments to act. Their approach combined meticulous research with theatrical public pressure that often proved more effective than quiet diplomatic efforts. Investigations often uncovered extensive networks of mutual protection among former SS men in South America. In Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil, former Nazis maintained German schools, social clubs, and business relationships that helped them avoid detection. These communities operated like secret societies, providing early warning systems about investigations, financial support for legal defenses, and safe houses for members whose identities were compromised. The work was complicated by time's passage and deliberate obstruction. Witnesses died or their memories faded, documents were systematically destroyed or hidden, and physical evidence deteriorated beyond recognition. Many suspected war criminals had powerful friends in governments, businesses, and intelligence services who actively worked to protect them from prosecution. Legal obstacles proved equally challenging. Statute of limitations laws in many countries prevented prosecution after certain time periods, and extradition treaties often contained political offense exceptions that clever lawyers could exploit. Some countries refused to extradite their own naturalized citizens, while others demanded extensive evidence that was difficult to obtain for crimes committed decades earlier across different continents. The case of John Demjanjuk illustrated the complex identification problems facing Nazi hunters decades after the fact. Accused of being Ivan the Terrible, a notoriously brutal guard at the Treblinka death camp, Demjanjuk was identified by several Holocaust survivors in emotional courtroom confrontations. He was extradited from the United States to Israel for trial, but the case was complicated by questions of identity reliability and the fallibility of elderly witness memory. His initial death sentence was overturned when evidence suggested possible misidentification. Intelligence agencies' Cold War recruitment of former Nazis created ongoing obstacles that frustrated hunters for decades. The CIA's Operation Paperclip and similar programs by other Western intelligence services had provided protection and new identities to thousands of former SS officers in exchange for intelligence about Soviet operations. Documents about these relationships remained classified for decades, making it impossible for investigators to obtain evidence about suspects' post-war activities and protection. Some former SS men had been so thoroughly integrated into Western intelligence operations that their prosecution became diplomatically impossible. They possessed sensitive information about ongoing operations and had been promised immunity in exchange for their cooperation. When Nazi hunters identified these individuals, they often found government agencies actively working to obstruct investigations and protect their former assets. The establishment of specialized prosecution units in various countries during the 1970s and 1980s marked a new phase in pursuing war criminals. The Office of Special Investigations in the United States, created in 1979, focused specifically on identifying and deporting Nazi war criminals who had entered the country illegally by concealing their wartime activities. Similar units were established in Canada, Australia, and the United Kingdom, representing growing international commitment to addressing past failures. These units developed sophisticated techniques for identifying suspects, including computer databases that could cross-reference names, dates, and locations from various sources. They used immigration records, displaced persons files, military documents, and survivor testimony to build cases against individuals who had been living quietly for decades as model citizens and community leaders. However, these specialized units also highlighted the fundamental limitations of pursuing elderly suspects for crimes committed decades earlier. Many defendants were in their 80s or 90s by the time they were prosecuted, raising ethical questions about the appropriateness of trials for individuals who might die before proceedings concluded. Defense attorneys frequently argued that their clients were too ill to stand trial or that the passage of time made fair proceedings impossible. The psychological toll on both hunters and hunted became increasingly apparent as the decades passed. Nazi hunters often became obsessed with their work, sacrificing personal relationships and financial security to pursue justice. Some suffered from nightmares and depression, haunted by the testimonies they collected and the horrors they documented. Meanwhile, suspected war criminals lived in constant fear of discovery, some suffering psychological breakdowns when their past finally caught up with them. As the war criminal generation aged and died, the window for traditional prosecution began closing. By the 1990s, most surviving SS men were in their 70s or 80s, with declining physical and mental capacity for trial. The focus began shifting from criminal prosecution to historical documentation and education, but the most determined hunters refused to give up their pursuit as long as any suspects remained alive. The 1980s and 1990s marked a final surge in accountability efforts, driven by the approaching end of the war generation. German reunification in 1990 opened access to extensive East German archives, revealing how thoroughly former SS men had integrated into West German society. Oscar Groening's case in 2015 represented one of the last major SS prosecutions. Known as the Bookkeeper of Auschwitz, Groening was convicted at age 93 as an accessory to murder for counting money stolen from death camp prisoners. His unusual willingness to testify openly and express remorse attracted worldwide attention. The legal principle established in Groening's case, that support personnel at death camps could be prosecuted as accessories to murder, opened possibilities for prosecuting other former guards and administrators. However, the advanced age of potential defendants meant few such cases could practically be pursued. Operation Last Chance, launched by the Simon Wiesenthal Center in 2002, represented a final attempt to prosecute surviving war criminals. While most leads proved fruitless, the operation generated thousands of tips and resulted in several prosecutions, highlighting continuing public interest in achieving accountability. Recent cases like Yakif Palai, deported from New York to Germany in 2018 at age 95, and Friedrich Karl Berger, deported in 2021 at age 95, marked final acts in the long pursuit of SS personnel. These cases illustrated how former camp guards had hidden in plain sight for decades, raising families and working ordinary jobs while concealing their wartime roles. The psychological profiles of aging SS men brought to trial revealed diverse approaches to confronting their past. Some expressed genuine remorse and willingness to educate younger generations, while others maintained innocence despite overwhelming evidence. Medical examinations raised questions about the ethics of prosecuting individuals with age-related cognitive decline. As the 2020s progress, the biological reality of aging means the era of prosecuting SS personnel is effectively ending. The few surviving members are now in their late 90s, and their condition makes prosecution increasingly problematic. Focus has shifted to historical documentation and education about their crimes. The incomplete nature of accountability serves as a reminder of the importance of swift justice after mass atrocities. Delays, political compromises, and practical obstacles allowed the majority of perpetrators to escape prosecution entirely, influencing the development of international criminal institutions designed to ensure more timely accountability. The story of what happened to SS men after World War II represents one of the most complex chapters in international justice. Of the estimated 800,000 men in Heinrich Himmler's organization, only a tiny fraction ever faced meaningful accountability for implementing the Holocaust and other Nazi crimes. The vast majority melted back into civilian life, aided by destroyed records, false identities, and a post-war world more concerned with reconstruction than retribution. Thousands escaped to South America through sophisticated networks, while others found Cold War protection where their anti-communist credentials made them valuable assets to Western intelligence services. Most disturbing was how many former SS officers successfully reinvented themselves within German society, becoming judges, professors, business leaders, and civil servants. The failure of denazification programs and practical demands of rebuilding Germany created rehabilitation opportunities that would have been unthinkable to victims of their wartime activities. Nazi hunters like Simon Wiesenthal and the Klarsfelds achieved dramatic successes: Eichmann's capture, Barbie's prosecution, and dozens of other cases bringing long-delayed justice. Yet these victories represented only a small fraction of perpetrators who escaped accountability. Most SS men lived out their lives in comfortable anonymity, their crimes known only to themselves and their victims. The legal and moral compromises made during the early post-war period had lasting consequences extending far beyond individual cases. Prioritizing strategic considerations over criminal justice in recruiting former Nazis sent a message that such crimes could be committed with relative impunity, undermining faith in international law. The final prosecutions of the 21st century, while symbolically important, highlighted that justice delayed is often justice denied. The failure to hold SS personnel fully accountable provided a template for impunity exploited by war criminals in Cambodia, Rwanda, Yugoslavia, and other contexts where mass atrocities occurred. The psychological impact on survivors of living in societies where their persecutors might be neighbors, employers, or officials represents one of the most profound injustices of the post-war period. Many survivors spent decades not knowing whether people around them had participated in their persecution, creating lasting trauma extending far beyond wartime experiences. As the biological window for prosecuting SS personnel finally closes, focus has shifted to historical documentation, education, and developing international institutions designed to ensure more timely accountability. The International Criminal Court represents attempts to learn from post-war justice failures and create more effective mechanisms for preventing impunity. The story serves as a permanent reminder that pursuing justice for mass atrocities cannot be delayed or compromised without profound moral and practical consequences. It demonstrates the importance of immediate documentation, swift prosecution, and international cooperation in holding perpetrators accountable. The incomplete reckoning with SS crimes highlights the resilience of human evil and individuals' capacity to compartmentalize actions and reinvent themselves. Understanding how ordinary men became genocide participants and how they subsequently returned to normal life remains crucial for recognizing and preventing similar patterns in contemporary contexts. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.